I departed from the ranger station at Sector 7 at 6:15 a.m. on a cold, overcast Tuesday morning in late October, carrying standard provisions for a routine 3-day maintenance patrol through the northern reaches of the Mist Valley Wilderness. My primary objective was to inspect the trail conditions along Broken Ridge and verify the integrity of the emergency shelters after the recent autumn storms. The initial hours of the trek were entirely uneventful, marked only by the familiar crunch of frozen pine needles beneath my boots and the dense morning fog clinging heavily to the valley floor. However, by 11:40 a.m., as the trail began to ascend steeply into a dense stand of ancient hemlocks, I became acutely aware of a profound shift. The forest, which had been alive with the typical chatter of gray squirrels and the distant calling of crows, suddenly fell into a state of absolute smothering silence. I stopped walking to listen, but there was no sound of wind in the canopy, no rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. The quiet was so intense that the steady rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat and the rush of blood in my ears became disorientingly loud. As an experienced ranger of 15 years, I knew that a sudden silence usually indicated the presence of a large predator, so I unholstered my bear spray and continued forward with heightened caution. Yet the oppressive stillness felt less like a warning and more as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By 5:30 p.m., the fog had risen from the lowlands, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet as I finally reached the remote timberline structure known as Cabin 12. I secured the heavy wooden door, built a small fire in the cast-iron stove to combat the dropping temperatures, and sat down at the wooden table to log my daily observations. It was exactly 9:12 p.m. when the standard Forest Service radio on my belt, which had been silent all day, began to emit a low, rhythmic pattern of static. I reached down to adjust the squelch, but the frequency remained locked, and beneath the white noise, I distinctly heard multiple human voices. They were whispering, their tones hushed and overlapping in a frantic, hurried cadence, though the words remained muffled as if spoken behind a thick sheet of glass. When I keyed the microphone and demanded to know if anyone required assistance, the transmission abruptly cut out, replaced by a dead silence that lasted only a moment before the exact same whispering pattern began echoing from directly outside the cabin walls. I grabbed my flashlight, unbolted the door, and swung it open into the freezing night air, but the beam revealed nothing but drifting sheets of fog and empty, motionless trees. No footprints were visible in the damp mud surrounding the threshold. The following morning, deeply unsettled, I decided to truncate the patrol and return to the base station via the Crypt Descent Path, a route that normally requires no more than 2.5 hours of steady hiking. I packed my gear and left the cabin at 8 a.m., but after 4 hours of continuous walking according to my watch, I found myself standing in front of the exact same cluster of twisted birch trees I had passed shortly after departure. I checked my GPS unit, but the coordinates insisted I was making steady progress southward at a normal pace, completely contradicting the physical reality of the landscape around me. Even more disturbing were the yellow trail blazes painted on the trunks. They now appeared at erratic, impossibly high intervals on the bark, far beyond the reach of any trail maintenance crew, as if the trees themselves were subtly stretching or shifting positions whenever I looked away. The spatial geometry of the woods felt fundamentally warped, inducing a persistent, dizzying sense of vertigo. I eventually broke through the perimeter and reached the ranger station at 6 p.m., having spent double the expected time in a forest I had mapped 100 times before. Though my official report cited nothing more than severe weather delays and navigation equipment anomalies, my private log reflected a much colder truth. The wilderness I have guarded for over a decade was no longer the same place. Over the next 3 weeks, I tried to convince myself that what happened was merely the result of fatigue or some bizarre localized atmospheric distortion. But a ranger's mind doesn't let go of inconsistencies easily. By mid-November, I requested a short, single-day follow-up patrol of the lower boundary of Sector 7, telling the coordinator I was just doing a final pre-winter check on the drainage culverts. I departed under a pale, featureless sky at 7 a.m., determined to prove to myself that the terrain was exactly as it had always been. But the moment my boots crossed the threshold into the tree line, the atmosphere grew heavy, cold, and instantly familiar. The distortion didn't wait until nightfall this time. It manifested by mid-afternoon. As I neared the dry creek bed known as Deadwood Wash, I was checking my topographic map when I realized that the sound of my own footsteps had become detached from my movement. There was a distinct, half-second delay between the moment my boot struck the gravel and the sound reaching my ears, creating a phantom echo that made it feel as though someone was walking precisely one step behind me. When I stopped, the extra step lingered for a fraction of a second before cutting off. I turned around repeatedly, drawing my sidearm under the crushing weight of the absolute silence that had once again settled over the valley, but the gray corridors of bare trees were completely vacant. My GPS unit suddenly began rapidly cycling through random dates and times, its digital screen flickering erratically before the display died altogether, leaving me entirely dependent on a compass whose needle was now spinning slowly and aimlessly in complete circles. Panic is a luxury a backcountry ranger cannot afford, so I forced myself to ignore the instruments and navigate purely by the ridgeline visible above the canopy, pushing a brutal, aggressive pace back toward the eastern boundary fence. Yet the wilderness seemed to actively resist my departure. The familiar contours of the valley grew elongated, the great trunks of the ash trees appearing so perfectly uniform and spaced at such mathematically precise intervals that it felt less like a natural forest and more like a poorly rendered, endless loop designed to keep me contained. It wasn't until 7:45 p.m., long after the sun had vanished, that the spinning compass needle suddenly snapped violently back to the north, and the distant, reassuring hum of highway traffic broke through the silence. I practically threw myself over the perimeter gate and back onto the asphalt of Route 9, panting heavily in the cold air as I looked back into the dark, silent wall of the Mist Valley woods. I haven't been back inside the tree line since that night. While I still sit at my desk every morning filling out routine paperwork, I know with absolute certainty that whatever is currently living inside Sector 7 is merely wearing the shape of the forest I used to protect. That night, after returning from Route 9, I sat in my parked patrol truck for nearly an hour, watching the dark perimeter of the woods through the rearview mirror. When I finally walked into the main station to log my keys, the night coordinator, a kid named Marcus, looked up from his paperwork and frowned, asking me why I looked like I'd just spent a week in the backcountry. I shrugged it off, but as I turned to leave, he mentioned casually that the radio tower had logged a series of strange, high-frequency data bursts from my assigned handheld unit around mid-afternoon, the exact time my GPS had died. He described it as a massive wall of compressed audio that sounded like hundreds of people talking over one another at a frantic pace. I didn't answer him. I just took my keys, walked out to my personal vehicle, and drove home. For the next 2 months, I successfully managed to avoid field assignments, burying myself in administrative tasks. I told myself I was just letting a bad case of burnout pass, but the truth was that every time I looked at a topographic map of Sector 7, the neat, concentric contour lines no longer looked like mountains and ridges. They looked like a trap. The illusion of safety shattered in late January when a heavy blizzard knocked out the automated weather telemetry station located at the highest point of the crypt descent path. The data from that station was critical for regional avalanche warnings, and because the winter staff was short-handed, the station manager specifically assigned the repair detail to me, noting that my 15 years of experience made me the only ranger qualified to navigate the upper ridges in sub-zero visibility. At 6 a.m. the following morning, strapped into heavy snowshoes and carrying a specialized electronics repair kit alongside my winter survival gear, I passed through the security gate and stepped back into the Mist Valley wilderness. The blizzard had transformed the forest into a blinding, featureless desert of white, with the wind howling through the bare branches at 40 knots, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Paradoxically, the extreme weather brought a strange sense of comfort. The chaotic, roaring violence of the storm was a real, tangible physical force, a sharp contrast to the unnatural silence I had encountered before. I made steady progress up the ridge, relying on the physical markers of the mountain crest, and by 1:15 p.m., I had reached the metal tower of the telemetry station. The repair was straightforward, a simple matter of replacing a shattered solar regulator that had cracked under the extreme cold. As the digital diagnostic screen on the control panel blinked back to life, showing a green status light, the automated system immediately initiated its standard audio check broadcast to ensure the emergency transmitter was functioning. Plugged my heavy winter headset into the maintenance jack on the side of the tower to listen to the test feed, expecting to hear the standard automated timestamp tone. Instead, filling the headphones with crystal clear clarity that bypassed the howling storm outside, came the exact same voice I had heard months ago in Cabin 12. Except this time, the whispers weren't muffled or overlapping. It was a single, flat, perfectly monotone voice, speaking with my own cadence and using my own vocabulary, reciting the exact coordinates of the spot where I was currently standing, followed by a final, chilling sentence: "The Ranger has returned to the location he never truly left." I ripped the headset from my ears, the plastic cracking in the freezing cold, and let it dangle from the tower jack. The monotone voice was still faint but audible, spilling out into the howling wind, repeating that final sentence over and over. I didn't bother packing my tools. I grabbed my pack, turned on my snowshoes, and began a reckless, lung-burning descent down the steep incline of the ridge. The wind grew into a deafening roar, but the blizzard around me began to behave in ways that defied physics. The snowflakes weren't falling. They were hovering perfectly still in midair, suspended in time, forming a crystalline corridor that guided me down a path I had never seen before. My watch, my compass, and my emergency beacon were completely dead, their screens blackened as if scorched by an internal fire. I was running blind, surviving on raw adrenaline, throwing myself through the freezing white void. It was nearly midnight when I finally stumbled out of the tree line. I didn't find the main station, nor did I find Route 9. Instead, I collapsed face first onto the gravel lot of a small, abandoned ranger outpost at the western boundary, a station that had been decommissioned and boarded up back in 1994. My lips were blue, my fingers completely numb from frostbite, but I forced myself to crawl up the creaking wooden steps and break through the rusted padlock on the front door, just to find shelter from the sub-zero wind. Inside, the air was dead and smelled of ancient dust and rotting paper. I pulled a crumpled box of matches from my pocket, my hands shaking so violently I dropped 3 before striking 1. The small amber flame flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the abandoned office. That was when I saw the desk. Sitting in the center of the dust-covered wood was a pristine, leather-bound notebook. It was my private log. I approached it slowly, the match burning down to my fingertips before I dropped it and struck another. With my numb, unfeeling fingers, I opened the cover. The pages were filled with my own handwriting, detailing patrols, weather conditions, and trail maintenance from decades ago, dates spanning from the 1970s through the 1990s. Page after page, the handwriting grew more frantic, describing a ranger named Edward Miller who kept getting lost in a forest that wouldn't let him leave. I flipped to the very last page. The ink was fresh, still glistening slightly in the matchlight. The final entry was dated today, January 24th, written in my exact hand, concluding with a short typed paragraph at the bottom. Subject has completed the loop. Perceptual adaptation achieved. Terminal integration successful. Prepare the terrain for the next rotation. The match went out. In the pitch-black darkness of the abandoned cabin, the howling winter storm outside suddenly vanished, replaced instantly by that familiar absolute silence. And then, from the dark corner of the room directly behind my chair, I heard the sound of a radio clicking on, followed by my own voice, whispering a quiet welcome back. The cold in that room didn't just freeze my skin. It sank deep into my chest, paralyzing my lungs. I stood frozen in the pitch darkness. My own voice kept whispering from the corner, a looping, rhythmic murmur that sounded less like a human being and more like a machine trying to mimic my breathing. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away slowly, my hands blindly tearing at the decaying wood of the doorframe until I stumbled backward, falling down the creaking steps and back onto the frozen gravel of the lot. The blizzard was gone. The wind had vanished entirely. Above me, the sky wasn't black, but a strange bruised shade of deep purple, illuminated by stars that didn't twinkle. They were perfectly static, tiny, mathematically precise pinpricks of white light arranged in geometric grids that made no sense. The forest surrounding the outpost looked like a wall of solid black ink. I began to walk, then to run, following the old cracked asphalt of the abandoned access road. But as I ran, the asphalt beneath my boots began to feel soft, absorbing the impact of my steps until the sound of my running completely died out. Once again, the absolute silence returned, swallowing the crunch of gravel and the frantic gasp of my breath. After what felt like hours of sprinting through the breathless dark, a pair of headlights cut through the gloom ahead. A vehicle was parked sideways across the road, its engine idling with a low metallic rattle. Relief washed over me so intensely that I nearly collapsed. I sprinted toward it, shouting for help, waving my numb arms. As I got closer, the shape of the vehicle became clear. It was a green Ford Bronco, the exact model used by the Forest Service in the early 1990s. The door was wide open, the interior dome light casting a pale yellow glow over the front seat. There was no one inside. I reached the driver's side and leaned in, desperate to use the vehicle's heavy-duty radio to call anyone outside this valley. But as my eyes adjusted to the dashboard light, my heart stopped. Resting on the passenger seat was a standard Ranger's Stetson hat, a vintage uniform jacket with the name Patch E. Miller, and a small battery-operated tape recorder. The reels of the tape recorder were spinning slowly. I reached out with a trembling hand and pressed the stop button, then the rewind. The mechanical whir of the tape was the only sound in the universe. I pressed play. A heavy burst of static filled the cab, followed by the sound of birds chirping, a beautiful, normal forest sound that felt entirely alien. Then a voice spoke. It was my voice, but it sounded younger, clearer, filled with the energy of a man in his early 20s. This is Ranger Edward Miller, logging my final patrol of the season. October 24th, 1992. I've reached the eastern boundary fence near Route 9, but the gate isn't here anymore. There's just more trees. The compass is spinning. If anyone reads this log, please note that the geometry of Sector 7 is expanding. I'm going to try to hike back toward the main station before my flashlight dies. End report. The radio on my belt suddenly sparked to life, emitting a blinding flash of blue electricity that scorched the leather casing and bit into my hip. I screamed, ripping the device off and throwing it onto the floorboards of the truck. The digital screen didn't die. Instead, the pixels shifted, forming a single, glowing line of text that began to scroll across the tiny display over and over again. Welcome to your 16th year of service. The headlights of the Bronco suddenly flickered and died, plunging the road back into total darkness. The idling engine cut out, and the suffocating silence slammed down on the valley like a heavy iron lid. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cold steering wheel. I didn't run anymore. The steering wheel beneath my hands felt cold, but it didn't feel like metal anymore. It felt like weathered bark, rough and dry against my skin. I opened my eyes. The dashboard of the 1992 Bronco was gone. The pale yellow dome light had faded into a soft, diffused morning glow that was filtering through a dense canopy of ancient hemlocks. I was standing upright, my back pressed against a massive pine tree. The snowshoes, the heavy winter gear, the freezing blizzard, all gone. I was wearing my standard lightweight autumn uniform. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled heavily of damp earth and fallen leaves. I looked down at my hands. They weren't blue or numb. They were perfectly fine, holding a fresh, unblemished official notebook and a black ink pen. My radio beeped twice. A crisp, clear voice broke through the speaker. It was the voice of the main station coordinator, sharp and perfectly normal. Station to Ranger Miller. Ed, do you copy? You've been quiet since your morning check-in. What's your current status over? I stared at the radio on my belt. The plastic casing was clean, completely free of any scorch marks. I reached down with a trembling finger, keyed the microphone, and brought it to my mouth. My throat felt dry like I hadn't used it in decades, but when I spoke, my voice came out steady, professional, and completely under control. This is Miller. Copy loud and clear, station. Just reached the top of Farlow Ridge. Trail is clear. No signs of erosion from the autumn rain. Proceeding toward the eastern wilderness section now. Over. Copy that, Ed. Keep an eye on the weather. There's some fog expected in the valleys by late afternoon. Report back when you reach the first shelter. Station out. The line went dead with a soft click. I clipped the radio back to my belt and looked around. The forest was beautiful. The sun was breaking through the autumn leaves, casting long golden beams across the path ahead. A blue jay called out from a high branch, its sharp cry echoing naturally through the woods. A light breeze rustled the canopy. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The geometry was perfect. The paths were clear. I looked down at the official notebook in my hands to log my 7:42 a.m. observation, just as I had done 1,000 times before. But as I opened the first page, the crisp white paper was already filled, written in my own precise, steady handwriting, covering every available line from top to bottom, was a single, continuous sentence repeated hundreds of times. I am an experienced and reliable ranger, and I have walked these mountains for 15 years. I stared at the ink for a long moment, watching a small ant crawl across the page. Slowly, the artificial rhythm of the environment began to align. A crow called out. Then exactly 60 seconds later, another. A branch snapped. Exactly 3 minutes later, another. The wilderness was no longer wild. It was a clockwork mechanism, operating on an immutable pre-programmed loop, and I was the hands turning inside it. By 4:34 p.m., the predicted valley fog began to bleed over the ridge, thick and silent, swallowing the base of the hemlocks until the world was reduced to the path beneath my boots. I reached the Farlow Gap shelter exactly on schedule. I unbuckled my pack and sat down at the wooden table. My fingers moved automatically, writing down the wind speeds and temperatures. When I finished, the pen lowered back to the paper against my will, scratching in tiny, cramped letters. The markers are wrong. The sky is a grid. I can hear the tape spinning underneath the dirt. I dropped the pen. It clattered against the wooden floorboards. The fog outside had pressed flat against the windows now, a solid wall of absolute white. The birds stopped. The wind died. The digital screen of my radio, still clipped to my belt, flickered to life, displaying a single, stationary counter, Adritanduwam. As I watched the frozen digits, the heavy wooden door of the shelter slowly began to creak inward. Emerging from the white mist, stepping over the threshold, was a figure. It wore the dark green winter jacket of the Forest Service. It carried heavy winter gear, its lips blue, its hands scarred by frostbite, eyes wide with the frantic terror of a man who had just escaped a sub-zero blizzard. It was the version of myself from the 1994 outpost. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the pristine leather-bound notebook, and placed it gently on the wooden table between us.
He couldn't speak.
His jaws were locked tight by a winter that hadn't happened yet. Then, the digital counter on my belt blinked once, transitioning from zeros to a new number, 100,000. With that single second, a voice broke through the radio speaker, vibrating through the log walls with a calm, bureaucratic indifference. Attention all units. Ranger Miller has logged the evening entry. Perceptual alignment within acceptable parameters. Initiating the evening fade. Good night, Edward. See you at dawn. The light in the cabin snapped off instantly like a bulb being turned off in a room with no windows. In the pitch-black cold, the chattering of the blue jay vanished, replaced by the sudden warm glare of the morning sun. I was standing on the gravel path at the Farlow Ridge trailhead. My uniform was clean. My hands were warm. In my right hand I held a fresh black ink pen, and in my left the official notebook, turned to the very first page. From the radio on my belt, the main station coordinator's voice cut through the clear air, bright and completely normal. Station to Ranger Miller. Ed, do you copy? You're scheduled to begin your baseline patrol of Sector 7. Let us know when you step into the tree line. Over. I looked down at the blank white paper of the notebook, then turned my head to look at the vast, beautiful expanse of the Mist Valley woods stretching out before me. The paths looked clear. The geometry looked perfect. I keyed the microphone, a calm, professional smile forming automatically on my face. This is Miller. Copy loud and clear, station. Beginning the first rotation now. Entering the tree line, over. I clipped the radio back to my belt, stepped off the gravel and walked into the shadows of the trees, disappearing completely into the forest I had guarded for 15 years, and would guard for 15 more. My name is David, and I have been a National Park Ranger for over 12 years. Throughout my career, I have seen just about everything you would expect in the wilderness. Rogue bears, stranded hikers, and sudden forest fires. But what happened to me in the summer of 2024, deep within the forests of the Black Ridge, made me question everything I believed in. It made me realize that things live in the depths of nature that do not answer to the laws of man. The story began when I was assigned to an isolated observation post known as Silent Cliff Station. The log cabin where I would be staying was about 30 miles from the nearest town, and the only way to reach it was on foot through rugged mountain trails. My supervisor, an old-timer named Edward, looked at me with a strange expression as he handed over the cabin keys. He said one sentence that I didn't understand at the time. "If you hear knocking on the door after midnight, don't look out the window. Just make sure the deadbolt is locked tight and try to sleep." For the first week, everything was peaceful enough to be comforting. I cleaned the cabin, organized my canned rations, and checked the daily hiking trails. But things changed abruptly on the 8th day. During a routine patrol near a deserted glacial lake in the North Forest, I stumbled upon something highly unusual: an old hiking boot hanging from a tree branch about 4 meters off the ground. There was no trace of its owner, nor any ladder or means that would allow someone to hang the boot there with such precision. Stranger still, the boot was completely dry and clean, even though it had rained heavily all through the previous night. On the 10th night, I woke up suddenly at 2 o'clock in the morning. The wind was howling outside and the tree trunks were grinding against one another, making a grating, uneasy sound. Then absolute silence fell. The sounds of the wind cut out entirely, as if the forest had held its breath all at once. Then came the sound that changed everything. Knock, knock, knock. 3 heavy, slow, and perfectly rhythmic knocks on the thick wooden door of the cabin. I remembered Edward's warning instantly. I froze in my bed, my instinct causing me to grip my rifle. I waited for the knocking to be followed by a desperate cry for help or a call from a lost hiker. But nothing happened except for that eerie silence. After 5 minutes, I grew brave enough to approach the door very slowly. I didn't look out the window, but I placed my ear directly against the wood. I heard something that made my blood run cold. There was the sound of heavy, deep breathing, far too massive to belong to a human, accompanied by a faint scraping sound like rough reptilian skin moving slowly against the exterior wall. Then I heard a whispering voice mimicking my supervisor Edward's voice with terrifying accuracy. "David, open the door. It's cold out here." But the pronunciation was warped and wrong. It slurred the word door into duel, as if the creature was just learning the words and could not quite master human phonetics. When the sun rose, I went outside immediately, armed with my rifle and camera. I examined the muddy ground in front of the door. There were no human footprints at all. Instead, there were deep-pressure indentations in the mud, moving on 2 legs. But the surface area of a single footprint exceeded 50 centimeters, and the stride length between steps was monstrously huge. I tracked the impressions for 2 kilometers toward the thick fog in the hidden valley. There, the tracks vanished abruptly at a giant boulder. On top of the boulder, I found an old 2-way radio belonging to a park ranger who had disappeared in this area back in 1994. The terrifying part was that the radio was actually functioning despite the years. Static was coming out of it, and every now and then the sound of a distorted childlike laugh would break through, before cutting back to silence. I decided to return immediately and call for an evacuation. But when I got back to the cabin, I found my bedroom window completely shattered from the outside. On my bed sat a deer skull, completely picked clean of flesh, neatly arranged right in the center of my pillow. Next to it were 3 deep scratch marks clawed into the wall. I knew then that the thing living in this forest did not want me to leave, and that it now considered me its new amusement. My name is Robert, and 5 years ago, I took over the management of Observation Point 5 in Shenandoah National Park. The area was notorious among rangers for Whispering Ridge, a sheer cliff perpetually covered by a thick, heavy fog that never cleared, not even on the hottest, driest days of summer. In the old station logs, there was a sealed file marked Confidential and labeled The Case of Expedition 7. In the autumn of 2011, a group of 7 professional climbers entered this ridge and set up camp. They never returned. At the time, authorities led the largest search operation in state history, involving helicopters and specialized K-9 units, but they didn't find a single clue, not even a backpack or a water bottle cap. The case was closed as an unsolved mystery, and camping in that area was permanently banned. I thought it was all just exaggeration and folklore used by veteran rangers to scare the rookies, until I met an old man named Thomas who lived on the edge of the park. Thomas said to me as he looked toward the mountain, "The fog up there isn't weather, son. The fog in that ridge is a living thing. It breathes, it moves, and when it hungers, it stretches out its limbs to take what it wants from our world." On a cold November night, the fog crept up unusually high, spilling over the ridge until it completely surrounded my cabin. Suddenly, my radar and radio equipment began emitting continuous piercing static screeches due to intense electromagnetic interference. I went out onto the exterior porch to check the backup generator, wearing a powerful headlamp on my brow. When I aimed the beam of the headlamp into the dense whiteout, I saw something that made my heart hammer violently. The fog wasn't shifting with the wind. It was shaping itself into distinct human-like silhouettes moving slowly through the mist. Suddenly, I heard voices coming from inside the fog. They weren't the sounds of wind or animals, but the distinct whispers of human beings. Do you think they will ever find us here? I am so hungry. Which way is the trail back? Look, there is a light up there. The voices sounded exactly like 7 different people, the overlapping tones of men and women. I immediately remembered Expedition 7. A terrifying shiver ran through me, and I felt the voices drawing closer to the wooden porch. I called out as loudly as I could while raising my weapon. Who's out there? I'm a park ranger. Stay where you are. I'm coming to help you. The moment I spoke those words, the tone of the voices in the fog changed instantly and horrifically. The whispering and complaining turned into a collective, hysterical, and incredibly loud laughter. The foggy silhouettes began moving at a frenzied pace around the cabin, slamming against the wooden walls with immense force, sounding like real human hands trying to break in. I ran back inside, locked the heavy iron door, and began monitoring the exterior security cameras, which ran on independent battery power. On the screen, there were no humans. Instead, the fog was coiling tightly around the cabin, squeezing it with immense pressure. Suddenly, a massive face, formed entirely out of fog and pale ambient light, pressed against the large living room window. A face with no eyes, its mouth hanging wide open as if preparing to swallow the entire space whole. This nightmare lasted until 5 o'clock in the morning. As the first light of dawn began to break, the fog suddenly receded, flowing back over the edge of the deep ridge as if nothing had ever happened. When I went outside in the morning to inspect the perimeter, I found that all the external cameras had completely melted, not from fire, but from a strange, corrosive, viscous substance that coated the walls. Worst of all, I found 7 identification cards stuck together with black mud sitting on the threshold of the cabin door. They belonged specifically to the members of Expedition 7 who had been missing for years, and the cards looked brand new and clean, as if they had been printed yesterday. Since that night, I have come to understand that some cases are closed not because of a lack of evidence, but because the evidence itself is more terrifying than the human mind can bear. My name is Sahir, and for 15 years I worked as a senior wilderness trail maintenance officer in the rugged, high-altitude territory of the Black Fog Valley National Park. In our line of work, you learn to read the landscape like an open book. You know the species of an animal by its footprint, and you know the shifting weather by the movement of the birds. But there was a section in the far northeastern reaches of the park known as the Dead Ridge, an area completely closed to the public by high-level administration since the 1970s. The official reason cited was the presence of toxic sulfur gas, leaks, and unstable subterranean movements. But as the person in charge of mapping and maintenance, I knew the geological sensors hadn't registered a single tremor there in decades. The real reason was sitting in my office drawer, in the form of 3 identical letters found in the backpacks of 3 different missing hikers, discovered years apart. They didn't contain desperate cries for help, but rather a single sentence written thousands of times until the ink ran dry. The mountain is not stone. It is a cage, and the copper rings below. On a summer morning, I received a confidential order to clear a trail near the edge of that restricted zone, after thermal surveillance cameras spotted a trespasser breaching the barbed wire perimeter and never returning. I packed 3 days of rations, a satellite phone, climbing gear, and my backup sidearm. The moment I stepped past the wire and entered the Dead Ridge, the atmosphere shifted. The air was unnaturally heavy, thick with a powerful scent of ozone like the smell of rain that precedes a violent thunderstorm. But worse than the smell was the silence, an absolute suffocating silence. No birds flew, no squirrels moved in the high grass, and not a single insect buzzed. Nature was entirely dead, save for a subtle, subaudible vibration, a frequency so low you couldn't hear it with your ears, but felt it rattling through the soles of your boots, as if the massive mountains around me contained a colossal engine operating deeply buried below. By evening, while tracking the trespasser's path along a rocky slope, I found his campsite. His tent was perfectly pitched, all his gear intact, but what caught my attention was his digital audio recorder. It had been systematically smashed to pieces, its internal copper wiring pulled out and meticulously braided into strange geometric symbols on the dirt floor. I opened his logbook. The first pages analyzed rock density and acoustic echoes, but the final page was written in a frantic, trembling hand. It's not an echo. It's a throat. If you stand on the red stone, the ground speaks in the voices of the people who died here before the park was built. They aren't dead. They're just trapped in the resonance. I decided to follow the footprints, which looked as though they had been violently dragged toward a massive vertical fissure at the base of the mountain, a cave system that didn't exist on any of our official maps. As I neared the opening, that subtle vibration intensified into a distinct metallic humming sound, like a massive copper bell that had been struck hours ago and never stopped vibrating. The air rushing out of the fissure was warm, damp, and carried a strange metallic taste that made the silver fillings in my teeth ache the moment I inhaled. I clicked on my high-intensity tactical flashlight and stepped inside. The cave walls weren't rough limestone. They were composed of a dark volcanic rock, completely smooth and polished as if carved by advanced machinery. After walking for nearly a mile into the subterranean darkness, my flashlight beam began to distort and dim into a strange hue, as if the darkness inside was heavy enough to compress the light itself. Suddenly, my two-way radio crackled to life on its own. It didn't emit standard static. Instead, a flat synthesized female voice began reading a repeating sequence of numbers: 42, 9, 11, 74, over and over again. I froze in my tracks as a cold dread washed over me. Those numbers weren't random. They were the exact geographical coordinates of the four most famous unresolved missing person cases in this park over the last 50 years. I tried to use my satellite phone, but the screen was completely glitched, displaying ancient geometric patterns instead of a digital interface. In that exact moment, the woman's voice on the radio went silent, replaced by a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the sound of a heavy zipper slowly opening, followed by the rustling of a sleeping bag in the dark, coming from just a few meters ahead of me. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound. The beam illuminated a narrow alcove, and in the center sat a vintage bright blue canvas backpack. A shockwave went through my entire body. This backpack belonged to my father, a park ranger who had disappeared in these exact mountains back in 1988, and whose body was never found. I approached the bag with trembling hands. I unzipped it to find a thermos of coffee, still steaming as if it had been poured minutes ago, and right next to it, a Polaroid photograph of myself as a young child, dated the year he vanished. Before my mind could even process this temporal impossibility, the metallic ringing in the cave stopped entirely. A terrifying heavy silence filled the space. Then, from the dark tunnel ahead, I heard footsteps. They weren't the hurried steps of an animal or a panicked hiker. They were slow, deliberate, and rhythmically synchronized with the beating of my own heart. I pointed my shaking light toward the passage. Emerging from the shadows was a figure wearing the olive-green uniform of a 1980s park ranger. Pinned to the chest was a name tag that read, Seher Sar. My throat tightened and I couldn't scream. I wanted to believe it was a miracle, but my survival instinct screamed at me to run. The uniform was pristine and new, but the body occupying it was fundamentally wrong. Its limbs were elongated, moving with a stiff mechanical motion completely devoid of human joints. As for its face, it had no face. It was a blank canvas of flesh, completely smooth with no eyes, nose, or mouth, but it was covered in thousands of microscopic holes that were expanding and contracting in perfect unison. Exhaling that warm, ozone-scented air, the entity raised a long, distorted arm and pointed directly at my chest. When it spoke, the sound didn't come from a mouth. It resonated from the very stone walls around me, a massive, overlapping choir of hundreds of voices. Men, women, and children all speaking at once, louder than thunder yet mimicking my father's exact cadence. You're late for your shift. Seher, the mountain is waiting for its echo. Pure panic took over. I drew my weapon and fired 3 rounds directly into the center of its mass. The bullets hit with a loud metallic clang like striking a steel anvil, The creature's body rippled like a liquid mirror for a split second before solidifying back into place, entirely unharmed. Instead of attacking, the thousands of microscopic holes on its blank face began to emit a high-pitched, deafening frequency. The sheer force of the vibration instantly shattered my flashlight lens, and I fell to the ground as blood began to leak from my ears. In the pitch blackness, guided only by a faint, sickly green bioluminescent glow that began to bleed from the cave walls, I scrambled backward on my hands and knees. I could hear the jointless, heavy scraping of its body advancing toward me, accompanied by the overlapping whispers of the missing, all calling my name, begging me to stop running and surrender to the resonance. I abandoned all my gear, pulled my tactical knife, and forced my body through the narrow fissure, tearing my skin and clothes against the sharp rock as I desperately fought my way back to the surface. I don't remember climbing the slopes or crossing the vast distances in the dark. All I remember is running blindly through the forest, the ringing of copper chasing me until I crashed into the perimeter fence. When the morning patrol found me collapsed on the ground, my hair had turned completely snow-white, and the hands and date of my digital watch had wound backward by 32 years. I submitted my resignation the very next day. The administration closed the Dead Ridge permanently, building a massive concrete wall over the cave's entrance and declaring it a restricted military zone. I live in a barren desert now where there are no mountains and no echoes. But every time I turn on an old television or pass beneath high-voltage power lines, the static begins to shift, and through the interference, I can hear a synthesized female voice reading the coordinates of my new home, followed by the faint metallic ringing of copper coming from deep beneath the earth.